Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited and grateful about the topic for today's episode. We're going to be talking about pet loss today. And joining us, I have a very special guest, Dr. Adam Duberstein is joining us. Adam, welcome to Grief is the New Normal.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
So do you mind introducing a bit about yourself, your background, and area of expertise?
Sure. I am a clinical psychologist licensed in Michigan and also with a PsyPack permit. So I can see folks in multiple states, which is pretty cool. And I got my doctorate in clinical psychology from the Michigan School of Psychology, where I'm an adjunct professor. I specialize in areas of ethics for therapists, also human development, lifespan development, especially emerging adolescents, as well as senior citizens. I work a lot, of course, just like every therapist, with anxiety and depression, grief and loss, including pet loss, which is today's topic, of course. And I also look at career and life transitions quite a great deal, as well as chronic illness and health-related psychology. So those are really what is in my wheelhouse.
Amazing. That's great.
Thanks. I like to have a variety of things going on. I'm also an existential type of practitioner and the existentialists often argue that human problems boil down to some combination of four things: loneliness, death, freedom, and meaning. And I feel like because of that, some of these areas have more in common than it seems.
Absolutely. I was noticing a thread in what you were sharing.
Cool.
And thank you for sharing that existential piece. I think that's important, and not often people don't get a lot of that insight into kind of those swarming ideas. So thank you for sharing that. That's great.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah. What led you to specializing in doing grief work and with that existential mindset, if you don't mind sharing a bit?
I've had some losses in my personal life, and I have also watched other people who are close to me cope with loss. And I think one of the things that really led me to it was my grandfather, when I was a kid, was in the clergy, and I would watch him deal with, and my grandmother too, bereaved congregants. And I didn't really understand what was going on there fully. I just knew that he was able to help. And then I took a long and winding path to becoming a psychologist, and I worked for many years in student affairs, higher ed admin, which is an interesting field in and of itself. I really enjoy working with folks in that field to this day, both as clients and as colleagues. One of the things I learned was that I could only do so much to help the students and supervisees who were in front of me without the proper training. And I watched a lot of them go through grief and loss and trauma that happened on the campuses where I work. That's part of what inspired me to do work in grief and loss.
And especially so Adam and I met at the APA conference in August, and we definitely bonded pretty quickly of talking about pet loss and also non-death loss. How did you see those coming into play when you were starting psychology journey?
So non-death loss first caught my attention when I was working at a university, and a few tenured faculty actually lost jobs. And I watched the impact that had on them, especially one gentleman in particular. And we were told that, oh, you're tenured, you'll never lose your job. And that's what this guy had expected. Lo and behold, for whatever reason, and I don't know the circumstances, he lost his job. Similar
Right.
to watching people lose a pet. It's not just, it's just an animal, get over it. People don't. I had a client, what really cemented my interest in this is I had a client who his gerbil died. At first, you think, oh, it's a gerbil, they don't have that long a lifespan. But this gerbil meant a lot to him. And it was just very hard for him to deal with the fact that the gerbil was gone. That's what led me into getting interested in pet loss and just loss and grief in general, both clinically and personally.
Yeah.
I've also watched my own dog grieve the death of one of my older dogs. And that's also been very eye-opening for me.
Yeah. So
How
let's get
interesting.
into talking about that pet loss piece. It's really deeply painful. And again, like we talked about, it's not fully acknowledged. It can often be minimized regarding a loss in society or considered a disenfranchised type of loss. So, the work that you've done, how do you see grief showing up in those pet loss spaces? And maybe what are some common misconceptions about pet loss?
Sure. So a common misconception is, oh, I can just get another animal and that'll solve the problem. It doesn't. Not at all. All a person is doing is forgetting that animals have different personalities. I've lost some dogs. I've had, as an adult, I've had five. And the best thing I've learned to do is wait just a little while, make sure you're ready. Because the dog, just because it looks like your previous dog, doesn't mean it's going to be like your previous dog or cat or insert animal here. The other thing that I think about how pet loss shows up, it shows up in forms of loneliness, depression, anxiety, confusion, anger, bewilderment, all of those things. And it can indeed impact how a person functions. And also it can make worse an existing addiction or mental health issue. And I think that's something that we haven't really, as a profession or as a society, talked a lot about, especially since so many of us therapists are animal lovers. We should
Yeah.
probably have that conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I think about pets being that tether that we talked earlier, like that sober companion. And when that tether, that thing that's anchoring us to a goal, a focus, a mindset, a state of being is gone, and then we're spiraling. That can feel really hard and amplifies that loneliness. When I had that pal that I was taking care of that was
Mhm,
dependent on me, that creature to nurture and to give me some purpose,
mhm.
that can be so unsettling. I used the word bewilderment earlier, and I thought that's such a great descriptor word for this.
Because bewilderment, I think you have to ask yourself, at least I ask myself why all the time.
Yeah.
All the time, I'm asking myself why. When a animal is sick, and I think a lot of clients have that experience too, because animals don't really do things to make themselves sick or get themselves into jams on purpose. They're not like people.
Yeah.
So I think about that too.
Yeah. It's a reflection of the care we've given them because they
Absolutely.
don't have
That's
the
yes, what I
ability
was
to
trying to say.
verbalize what's going on. And it's us paying attention and noticing. And so I think that why question comes up a lot, or then the guilt comes up. I could have done more. We start shooting ourselves. Like, I should have seen it sooner, or I missed that one dose. I was so busy, and oh my
Right.
gosh. And or I forgot to take them to the vet for 6 months and we didn't get things checked like we had been because life was just busy. And
Right.
yes, yeah, absolutely.
The blame and shame.
Yeah.
That makes it and I think that's very much a thing a lot of I think part of it is too, when you're feeling responsible for another living being, there is a lot of blame and shame. The animal companion, I think, is the phrase people prefer to use. The animal companion, human companion relationship in many ways mirrors that of parent and child.
Mm.
So sometimes I think that the human brain reads the loss of a pet as similar to the loss of a child. I'm not saying exactly the same.
But that's similar with our brains, the physiological experience of excitement and afraid. They have a
Right.
very similar physiological response. So that would make sense that when there is that nurturing parent child dynamic, that would make sense that our brains would imprint that or could imprint that on an animal human companionship dynamic
Right.
because it's still that nurturing, that caregiving piece. Absolutely.
No, and we're hardwired really to look out for the things that we nurture. This is something that impacts people's work, that impacts people's functioning, that impacts people's relationships. And I feel like our society is much too dismissive of pet loss. Pet loss is real, and it's the loss of an important figure in a person's life. And I think it's important to acknowledge people's grief and understand that the grief is their reality right now in the moment, even if a person themselves is just an animal. It's not, though. To that person, it wasn't. It would be the same as if somebody, I don't know, great grandparent died at the age of 110, and then the person reacts, that's just an elderly, very elderly individual. That's not a, death is an unfair and awful thing, no matter who is dying and no matter at what point in life they die.
We live in such a grief-phobic society,
Absolutely.
and we live in such a comparative society. And so I
Yes.
think
Right.
we want our grief to mean more. And sometimes people get in that headspace loop where one of their friends or a family member lost a pet, and then but I lost my friend. It makes it easy to get into that comparative, the minimizing of the
Right.
impact of that pet loss, when really, like we talk about on the podcast all the time, each grief is valid. There's enough pieces of the pie. You don't
Mhm.
have to justify that your piece of grief needs to take up more space or someone's can't
Absolutely.
take up more space because it's quote unquote just a pet. They were their companions. That's a significant loss. And it can mean just as much to that person as you losing a grandparent or a friend. Pairing doesn't make it more or less valid.
It's interesting. I've worked with enough clients to say people grieve not only humans and animals, but people grieve the loss of a dream. People grieve the loss of a thing, like an inanimate object. Grief can be over literally anyone or anything or any situation. And as therapists, we have to make sure that we honor one another's grief. One of the things I study is the intersection between politics and mental health, public
Ooh.
policy and mental health. And I've even seen people grieve the loss of an election, which they didn't even participate in. They didn't even have someone they knew running. It was just how they felt about candidate A and B. Just something that isn't so direct can be grieved,
Yeah.
direct in somebody's orbit. Then we can literally grieve anything.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Again, it's floating back to those non-death losses, and
Right.
they can have just as much weight as a physical death loss. And I think
Absolutely.
in our society, the word trauma is trending.
Right.
And what I'm really curious about or want to flesh out more is that idea of, okay, is it trauma or is it actually grief? And because we're in a grief phobic society, nobody's actually
Mhm.
named that it's grief. And
Right.
clinicians aren't as comfortable talking about grief. So they'll label it trauma because, well, trauma that I can treat. Grief, you
Right.
can't fix. It doesn't mean
Right.
something is broken or needs to be pathologized or a diagnosis. It's a typical reaction to a type of loss. It is the most
Absolutely.
universal lived human experience, and it can apply to tangibles and intangibles.
Right. It is indeed one of it's one of the four existential givens: grief and
Yes.
loss.
Yeah,
What do grief and loss lead to? Questions of meaning, loneliness and isolation, those kinds of things.
absolutely. And when you think about the ripples, the secondary losses, most of those are non-death related. So you have the
Right.
primary loss event, whether that was your feelings about an election result or losing a companion or losing a
Right.
person. And then you have the ripples of that and the grief bursts that come up over time. When I was talking with my partner last week and we thought about our dog Winnie, and she's been passed for 3 years now and we still miss her. And my 7-year-old misses her. It's like he remembers her, and even though he was only 3 when we lost her. And
Sure.
those ripples, they keep happening. And again, they're more non-tangibles, but they still pack just as much of a punch.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about what you had just said there, Heather, too. I was talking with my mom of all people, and she's not a therapist. She just wants to play one on TV. One of the things she said to me once that I think was very profound was that grief leaves a bit of a scar, that it heals over in time. It's never going to fully go away, that it is totally okay to miss someone who has died 25, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I thought when she told me this, when I first started out as a therapist, I was like, yeah, I don't know. But the more I've worked with clients, the more I've seen it. I've had elderly clients who have been in tears over the dog that has been gone or the cat who's been gone since they were 15, as they remember back, even though this happened 60 years ago.
Sure.
I think that there's a time limit, perhaps, to the intensity of grief, one could
Yeah, that
argue.
acuity. Yeah.
Acuity, exactly. But is there does it ever 100% stop? Certainly not. I remember I sat with a lady once who was in her 80s, and she was talking about her grandfather who'd been gone for 65 years, and she was tearing up. We often forget that there's a window of acuity but just never fully leaves.
We say that all the time, like grief never goes away. It just gets different. We learn to
Yes,
carry it with us through different
precisely.
seasons, but it never fully goes away.
No, it never fully goes away. And I think we would do well to remember that. And then the question becomes, where do people channel their grief? I think about that too, especially in terms of pet loss. And one of the things that I've shared with some of my clients is they can adopt another animal when they feel ready to, just realizing that animal won't necessarily have the same personality of their
Mhm.
previous animal. Also, too, if you can't adopt, foster, if you can't foster, donate. But there's other things people can do too. Just go to your local shelter, walk the dogs, pet the cats, take care of the animals that don't have anybody. Animals, I think, in our society are some of the most untapped resources for mental health and well-being, because to your point earlier, they help to give us a sense of purpose. Um, they really do. I have seen people on the brink of self-destruction, but they don't do anything because who's going to feed Rover?
Yeah.
Or I think it's really critical that we make other animals' lives and people's too as high quality as we can.
Yeah. I even think of coming out of the peak of COVID. I live in the Seattle area, so think Amazon and everything. Everybody got dogs. Everybody
Yes,
got
yes,
dogs during like the height of
right,
the pandemic. Pet adoptions were through the roof. There were like hardly any animals in rescue shelters because everybody was wanting that extra companion and comfort. And that's been interesting seeing that dynamic shift as people are moving back into the office and offices needing to adopt like good pet policies because everybody has these companions now. And also thinking about over the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a wave of pet loss just
right,
because of ages of animals. And
right.
what do you think? What do you think is helpful for people to know as they navigate watching their pets age, that anticipatory grief piece, think that you've worked through with your clients?
One thing that I think about is that animals live very much in the here and now. They do not know. They might know if they're sick, but they don't know the extent of it. So enjoy the moment with them. That's what they want you to do, and that's what we should be doing. The other thing that I think about is they also don't know that they're older. They don't know they're aging. I have a dog who is almost 9. She's out running around playing with the other dogs right now, not at all realizing that she is almost 9 years old. She has no clue. She thinks she's a puppy, which is fine. They don't know. They're not conscious of the same things that we are. They operate on a different plane, which is pretty cool. Also, too, the thing that I think about with anticipatory grief is that as long as they're still here, they're still present with us. That's the most important thing, is to, like I said, be there with them in the moment. Enjoy them when you have them. They don't wake up in the morning anticipating like we do. They wake up being like, oh, wow, it's a new day. What new smells will there be? What can I get into? So it's really, in a way, they provide us with an antidote to that anticipatory grief with a mindfulness, in a sense, because that's all about presence and being in the present.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. That tether to like, it's okay to be present in this moment. They're not future tripping. They're not catastrophizing. They're just like, oh, has my human given me breakfast yet?
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, is there a squirrel in the backyard? Yeah, I think that's such a good reminder. They're so grounding.
Very grounding. They don't worry about details the way we do.
Right. Unless you're going on a walk.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes.
And then you go to the drawer and you grab the leash and yeah, and my dog loses it. I know what's happening. We have a
Well,
dog.
they
So
know.
I have private practice 2 days a week. And so we have a dog
Cool.
walker comes those 2 days.
Yeah.
So she knows her best friend is coming those 2 days when I go to the drawer at a certain time. And she's so fun. They know those patterns.
Oh, they totally know patterns. Mine go
Yes.
to daycare one day a week, and they know what day it is. They know.
Yeah. So for those that are grieving a companion or experiencing another type of non-death loss, what would you say are some essential self-care practices that can be really helpful in that after space? And how can friends and family support in a way that feels validating and helpful? What's good language to use?
Sure. So for friends and family, what I would say is to treat the loss as real and valid and acknowledge it as though the same way you would acknowledge the death of a person. Because to their loved one, that is like a person died in their life.
Yes.
Grief is grief at the end of the day. And I feel like you had said the grief phobic society expects to have a level of volume on grief. Oh, if a person dies who's related to you in this way, you should grieve this much. And then if it's just an animal, grieve lots less. And if it's your guy next door, you can grieve a little more. But if you didn't know them that well, you don't have to grieve as much. And that's not really how it works in practicality. There are people who grief is a very individualized experience. And some people might grieve an animal harder than a person, and that's okay. I was actually talking with another therapist who was telling me that he had a guy who was telling him about the dog that he had lost. And apparently this dog and this guy's client would watch TV together. The dog would lay on the guy's shoulder and they would just watch TV. And the guy says to the therapist, I am feeling more sad about this dog than I am when my own grandmother died. What's wrong with me? And the therapist that I know said, did your grandmother lay her head on your shoulder when you were watching TV together? And of course not. Just the point the therapist was making is that the dog and this man had a very close relationship, different from the relationship between this guy and his grandmother, which you could argue is perhaps more distant.
I think that's so important to remember. And we talk about this on the podcast. Like each grief experience is unique to the relationship that it was.
Right. Exactly.
And again, just because it's assumed there might be more closeness between, like you said, a grandmother and their grandchild, just because you're assuming that doesn't mean that's the reality. And so
Precisely.
how that individual grieves their grandmother is going to look different versus their daily companion. They're going to miss that warm spot on their shoulder watching TV every night because that was the daily routine and rhythm and other points of comfort and contact. And so I think each loss is unique unto itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, you said that perfectly. Each loss is indeed unique unto itself. And you had asked about self-care. It's helpful when they don't blame themselves. I also think about doing things that are going to pay things forward for the deceased. So for somebody who's lost a pet, what can they do? Could they donate 50 cents even in the name of another animal? Could they give that pet's toys to the local animal shelter? Could they do something to pay it forward? If they've lost a person, could they eat a food that the person liked? Could they remember the person by planting a tree, or even remember a pet by planting a tree?
Yes.
So I think about things like that. Like we can take some concrete actions to remember our loved ones. And I think it's important that we do. It may not be creating a whole new ritual, but it may be doing something to pay it forward. Hey, they're caring for us forward.
The legacy work.
Exactly.
Yes. And I think back to this one client. They lived in Eastern Washington, so it was really hot over there in the summers. And their dog would always steal ice cream. And so for 2 or 3 years on the anniversary of their dog passing, they'd go get an ice cream cone and get like a little extra cup and just have that as a memorial ritual for remembering their dog, and that they'd go get ice cream together. And anyways, it's so sweet.
That is sweet.
And I think we can be creative with how we do ritual and memorializing for our companions.
Absolutely.
In a similar way we do for our human companions.
No, I was reading this morning about a local church that was doing a blessing of the animals. And I have seen different denominations, different faiths do these types of rituals. Apparently there are even, my supervisor was telling me about this, there are even animal chaplains now to help people get through the grief process. And it just sounds like a very interesting process also to do other animal related celebrations. So not necessarily just a celebration of life or grief work. Oh, my animal just got certified as a service dog types of things. Perhaps a ceremony for that, if you were so inclined. I think that we often forget that for a lot of people, that pastoral care is important in the way of with grief and loss, but that also includes within pet loss.
Yes, I'm part of another little griefy community, and there's a pet loss doula. So,
Wow. Yeah, that's
right?
becoming a
Isn't it?
thing. Yeah, yeah. That is
Yeah.
a thing now.
It is
Yes.
a thing now. And I think that's so lovely that in these pockets of our society, we're finding like there's getting more foothold in having those grief supports when we're going through something that's really hard to help us in that transition in that middle space. And that applies to pet companion loss in the same way.
Yes, absolutely. It really does. Those doulas are there not only for the comfort of the animal, but also the comfort of the person.
Yeah.
It's important to recognize that the therapists are getting better at hopping on the pet loss and animal related issues stage. Veterinary social work. In fact, the veterinary social workers had a conference this last weekend that I would have totally gone to if I could. And I think that really psychologists and the counselors need to also support this as well with more in our professions. So many people come in and talk with me about pet loss and the impact animals are making in their lives now. And with pet loss too, it may not even be necessarily the death of a pet. It could be I lost my animal in my divorce proceedings. It could be I lost my animal ran away. There are all kinds of ways perhaps to conceptualize pet loss that we don't even really as a society think about.
That brings up such a good point because grief compounds when we're experiencing either a non-death loss through a move, a job promotion, lost friendship, a thing, then you lose a pet either through running away or death. And then maybe even you experience a physical death related loss to a loved one, a human companion. And
Right.
it all compounds on one another. Grief builds. It
It
doesn't,
does.
it's not, oh, I'm having an isolated incident of grief around my pet. It's no, it brings all of the other losses to the forefront. And so I think that could
Right?
even double down or triple down on the acuity we sometimes experience
Yes.
due to a pet related loss because it brings
Yes.
up all the history or what else also is happening in the present.
Absolutely. It really does. No, we don't think about the acuity of it. And it would be nice if there probably is one floating out there about some scale about the acuity of pet loss. It would be great if somebody, so if you are working on a dissertation and need to top it, you're a doc student, that might be something to look at.
So as we start to wrap up, what would
Sure.
you say are some 2 or 3 key takeaways when we think about for our listeners to take home?
First thing is that it as pet loss is normal grief. It is okay to grieve your pet. It is okay to grieve your animal companion. Absolutely. And you should grieve them. Second thing is, while it's okay to grieve, don't marinate in the grief. Let the grief propel you forward to pay forward their care and concern for you. The third thing that I think about is we talked about anticipatory grief. Be with your pet in the moment. Be with your animal in the moment. Enjoy their company. They're not focused on what's happening next Thursday. They're not even they're thinking about maybe what's for lunch or dinner, but they're not really thinking beyond that. And that's okay. They shouldn't be. So focus on them. Enjoy your time with them. They're definitely going to focus on you. And also, too, go do fun things with them. Take them out to Starbucks or wherever for your coffee shop for a pup cup. Go on that walk with them on that new trail. They will appreciate it and it will be good for all of you. Even if you have a pet that is a goldfish or something and you have one of those little ornaments in the tank, switch out the ornament for something new. Give them something novel. Keep they animals like routine. They also like occasional changes and they will just be glad to know that you're there taking care of them. That's the great thing about animals is there's no judgment, no expectations other than they just want to know that you care about them and they will provide you so much joy and care in return.
Was there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping I was going to skew out today?
The only thing I can say to reiterate, and you asked about it already, is just that pet loss is a normal grief experience. Just because somebody has lost a pet doesn't mean their grief is lesser. In fact, it's equal to any other type of loss. And it is very important that people grieve in a way that feels healthy to them.
Oops. Dr. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I think this has been such a great starting conversation about bringing pet loss into light and talking about that it's just as valid of a type of grief.
My pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful to be with you this morning, Dr. Heather.
So if people are interested in connecting with you, what's the best way for them to reach out, whether through social media or email? Or
Yeah, I would love to talk with people further if they have questions. The best way to reach me is through my website, www. You can also send me an email. It's just adam@adamduberstein.com. And I would be happy to talk with anybody who has questions or comments or other ideas.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to include that link in the show notes so that people can just click right to your website.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. And
thanks, you too.
And listeners, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And remember to be kind to yourselves today. Take care.
That's all for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it. And if you're looking for more support or resources, feel free to head over to The Morning Movement, where we continue to build community and normalize these hard, beautiful parts of life. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and until next time, be kind to yourself. Opening and closing music is provided by the Datacorns. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, collaboration, or training opportunities, feel free to email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. And podcasts are also now available streaming on YouTube.